partnership with Bar and Bench. Before we start, a couple of basic housekeeping things that all of you are actually on mute. But if you have questions, just put it in the chat box, which you'll see on the bottom right corner of your screen. And we'll take up your questions and I'll announce them here and we'll take them up for discussions. So I'm Mahesh, I'm a faculty at Daksha and I'll be moderating today's session. Let me take a few minutes to just introduce the topic. So for the last 2 or 3 weeks, we saw the data debate going mainstream. Politicians are stepping in and they're talking about the Arogya Setu app and the privacy concerns around it. In the little state of Kerala, which has done pretty well fighting the coronavirus, use of a platform called Sprinkler, which is a big data company, the use of their platform entered into a big political debate there and it resulted in litigation. And of course, the government went on record to say that we cannot fight this pandemic without the use of this instrument. So we hear more and more great uses of big data and big breakthroughs in the realms of health, in service delivery, in the making of policy, and a wide variety of other things. But on the other end of the spectrum, we also have a lot of concerns that are coming up. Most of it is around surveillance, about its potential for massive surveillance of people at the population scale, behavior modification at the population scale, and concerns around reproducing the current biases in the way we are actually running the world. So amidst all of this, individual privacy is more or less the axis around which we conduct these debates. But we should ask this question, is that the only framework? Don't we really need a broader canvas of society, of social relationships, of political systems, of the way we run our polity itself? So Philip Alston's report, who is the special rapporteur to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, Philip Alston actually explores the relationship between, he looks at all these developments and he makes this remark that, we see this huge change in the relationship between the individual and the state itself. From saying that the state is actually accountable to the individual in some way, we are sort of reversing it, and now the individual is called out to be accountable, whether it is for the purpose of receiving some benefit or whether it is for the purpose of proving himself as a citizen or as a part of the polity. So probably it's time for us to engage with these questions and move our canvas beyond individual privacy and just individual rights. And for this, I have the pleasure of introducing 2 brilliant panelists with us today. We have Usha Ramanathan and Prerna Mukherjee. Usha really does not require an introduction for us lawyers. She's an internationally recognized expert on law and poverty. Breathtaking work that spans across environmental law, labor law, law and technology. And she's a frequent advisor to a large number of NGOs. She has worked on different committees of the government. On behalf of Daksha, let me welcome Usha to this panel. We also have with us Prerna Mukherjee, who is the founder of an organization called Outline India, a for-profit social enterprise that works to create social impact through data. The research startup has really revolutionized the way in which we look at data, the way data is collected, analyzed, and utilized for social schemes and programs by a wide variety of consumers, including academics, policymakers, corporate sustainability teams, and of course the government of India. And what is interesting is that there is a distinct rural focus in her work. In the course of the last about 10 years, she has interviewed over 4 million stakeholders, and her work has a distinct focus on governance and the way services are delivered by the government in the grassroots. Prerna was featured twice on the Fortunes magazine 40 Under list for her disruptive work with ground level data. On behalf of Daksha, let me also welcome Prerna into this panel.
Thank you for having me, Mahesh.
Yeah. So let me actually shoot the first question to Prerna and let's open the debate with that. Prerna, would you tell us about your work and how database decisions have transformed policy and about how implementation of different government programs on ground has changed with that, especially around the way we understand human behavior and we attempt to modify human behavior?
Right. So thank you for having me, Mahesh. Just to quickly jump into some of the work that we focus on. So we are in essence a data firm and we work only in the impact space. And we think that if you can get the data component of research right, you can thereby, inform policy making. So whether you're a think tank, you're an academic or university, a policymaker, a donor, a multilateral organization, whether you're looking to launch a new scheme, whether you've been running a new scheme, or you want to scale something up, you want to replicate something, all these decisions are big exercises. They are intense exercises. And in a country such as ours, where the impact can span a couple of 100,000 to a couple of million people to policy at the national scale, I think data can be instrumental in terms of affecting change. And organizations such as ours are there to bolster the work of these policymakers and these change makers. And we're kind of like the ears and eyes on the ground for a lot of partners, many of whom are also based abroad. So we work with a lot of academics who get funded by corporates or by the Indian government, by the World Banks of the world, by United Nations. And we're like the ears and eyes on the ground. So we help operationalize these large scale data collection exercises. And when I talk about data, Mahesh, I'm talking about qualitative data. I'm talking about the stories behind numbers. So when I mention data, a lot of people misinterpret it to mean just quantitative surveys. No, that's not what I mean. I mean qualitative information, conversations with people. In fact, a couple of years ago, we were using drones to collect spatial data to kind of overlay that on qualitative and quantitative information. And we're kind of like a social assessment organization. So we help you effectively measure whether something's working. If you're looking to launch something, we help you answer data-centric questions about whether it will work. And again, like, just as you pointed out, by default, we work with the superset of India. So there's very little work we actually do in urban areas. The majority of our work is rural, remote parts of the country. Just to take a couple of examples about the kind of work that we've done in the last couple of months. And this is an interesting one. So when the government launched Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, which is the Clean India campaign, there was this halabaloo about whether it's creating any behavioral change at all. I mean, we saw a lot of celebrities being looped in. We saw Nandita Das on television. We saw Madhuri Dixit on television. We saw limericks, painted on school walls. But has that had any deep-seated impact in terms of my everyday life as a school kid? Am I more likely to wash my hands before I grab a meal? If I'm a mother cooking a meal for a newborn, am I more likely to boil water and serve it to my young offspring? So these are the kind of questions that we will go in very deep. In fact, we work very closely with some other research partners, and we do something that's called content testing. So Sachin Tendulkar was looped into the Swachh Bharat campaign, and the goal was that if kids see Sachin on a little game and he's telling kids to wash their hands or to follow certain hygienic practices, can we sort of go a little bit further into our heads and get these respondents to act a certain way? We went as far as the Kumbh Mela, which is supposed to be one of the largest congregations of people for a certain religious purpose. And we got into metrics as specific as, has the waiting time to get to a washroom gone down in terms of the previous Kumbh Mela? So if I earlier was waiting for 180 seconds, am I now waiting for 150 seconds or lesser? We do something that's called content testing maybe. So we had these show cards, a lot of colorful pictures, and we try and study what we call word association. So if I show you a tap, what's the first word that comes to mind? If I show you a mucky hand pump, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And it's kind of these techniques, including a lot of game theory and behavioral economics and a lot of data prediction, that we kind of try and advise our partners about what might work, what may not work. Taking this a step further, Mahesh, we started thinking about a year and a half ago that there's a lot of partners we're not being able to service. And if I just get into numbers, India is home to about 3.1 million not-for-profits. That's a lot of NGOs working on the ground, but no one knows who they are. No one knows which sector they're working in. No one knows who's doing a good job. No one knows who's doing a bad job. And then you have all this body of money, which runs into about $2 to $3 billion that's coming into India for donors, for not-for-profits, for policymakers. But if you think about it, we still don't know where this money is going. And so we thought, what if we could make social assessments a little bit cheaper? What if we could sort of loop in not-for-profits that were disbursing a lot of this money into this decision-making process? And we kind of set up trachiometrics. And so while in a country such as ours, wherein a majority of us are still not online, technology is not the end all be all of it. I definitely do think that technology is an enabler. And I think this because we're a big country. And if you have to suggest solutions, they have to be at scale. If they have to be at scale, they have to be cheap. And by default, that does kind of lead us to technology. I'm not saying, again, I'm not going to say that it's going to cover all stakeholders. If you go 50 kilometers off New Delhi or Bombay, a lot of realities change. It's usually one small Java phone at the household level, or it's usually the male member who's got that phone, and maybe a lot of women and a lot of children don't have internet access, or even if they do have internet access, there's very specific type of information that they're accessing. So when I talk about policy making and impact building, what I like to convey to my partners is let it be very inclusive. Data has to be inclusive, and data, when we talk about the larger Indian context, I like to err on the side of caution and say, let's talk more about small data and not so much about big data sets, which largely refer to those trillions of data points we get off the web. Over to you, Mahesh.
Thank you, Prerna, for that. And those are interesting points that we really sometimes miss, that when we pursue big data, who are the set of people who are getting excluded. There's a whole conversation about how we should actually improve our data sets, and otherwise how we are actually going to reproduce the biases that we have in our existing systems. But my question for Usha is, I don't think anyone can quarrel with the idea that we need to have evidence-based policy, and that we need data-based decisions. And to that extent, it's not something like a new startling proposition. For some years, we've actually looked at empirical evidence for a large number of things, and we've taken decisions around that, and we've framed policies around that. We have revisited many policies on the basis of that. But then, what is the scale at which we pursue these things? I mean, for the sake of better decisions, we really keep deciding that let's have more and more and more data. Let's actually open up everything that we do at a granular level for people to study, for people to observe. So then probably we can end up improving things in some direction. So my question is, what would be the social implications of going around such an approach of let's pursue big data in all its beauty?
So I think I'll start with this, that I think big data still defies definition. Big data is not really about having, it's like Prerna said, I mean, you can have, it's not having large amounts of data. So big data is really about collecting the kind of information which they say is not granular and which does not say more than things like, for instance, if it's a phone call, you know when they called, you know the timing when they called, you know what numbers they called to, you know how long they spoke, but you don't know what they spoke. So this is considered only to be big data. I want to take a slightly different, start from somewhere else. And I just want to say what are the thing that interests me immensely in this, at this point, is how something that excited all of us in the first decade of this century is beginning to scare us now. And when I say this, I'm saying, for instance, when the mobile phone came in, most people were very excited having a mobile phone, feeling that they can walk around with it, they can talk from anywhere. When the internet opened up the way it did, it was like you could know about the world, you could, you know, the kind of information that was flowing into us. Then when Arab Spring happened, it seemed like power was being put in the hands of the people. All this made it sound very exciting. It was very exciting. But we find that from about 2009-10, around the world, there have been anxieties that have been emerging about this idea of technology and the idea of what is being done with these technologies. So I want to make a distinction, first of all, between technology as a tool and technology as our master. I think in our understanding of it, we need to make that distinction. And just a few axioms and axiomatic positions that have emerged, I'll just list them. We can discuss them if we have time, or in any case, I'll just list them. The first is that in our context, we've seen that, and in fact, in many contexts, the idea that privacy is dead. You can't have the kind of uses of technology and technology controllers doing what they are doing unless you can kill the idea of privacy. Privacy is not about my neighbor knowing about me. Privacy is about power. And that's the reason there is so much contestation about it. who knows what about whom? I mean, this is a country where we saw the Right to Information Act come in, where we said that persons in positions of power and authority should be transparent, and what they are doing should be transparent to a people. Very quickly after that, it got inverted, and people had to be transparent to these decision makers. So there is this, that's one thing that I think we need to understand. Second thing is, there is this pushing of an idea that consent is broken. And therefore, consent is not the point. Let's create a consent architecture, let's have, and then voluntary becomes mandatory, mandatory becomes coercion, coercion means punishment. It may mean just exclusion, it may mean just punishment, it may mean a combination of these. So this has become the other axiom, consent is broken. The third thing is a question that I think we need to ask. All of us revel in this, that we get free internet, free mail, free everything, free films, free whatever. But yet, all these people who are supposedly providing all this to us for free have become the richest. So 5 out of the, if 7 out of the 10 richest in the world, companies and people, was oil. In this, very quickly we've seen from early this century that 5 of them at least, sometimes 6, are technology companies and persons who are making their money. So where is all this money coming from? Who's generating it? What are they making that money on? And if you tell me advertising, I'll say, let's just sit back and think again. What does it even mean? If you can become the richest in the world by advertising through what? So this is about knowing, not thy neighbor, but knowing the world. The next is that because they've become the richest, they've also become the biggest philanthropists of the world. And what does it mean for all of us if those who control our data are also going to be those who make the most money and then tell us what is the priority that the world should have? So there are questions, for instance, today being raised about the interest that Mr. Gates has in vaccines. The fact that it is not doctors who speak to us, but it is Mr. Gates who's telling us about, what the coronavirus is, who are these people who are making these vaccines, when it will be ready, and that it should be, enforced on the whole world. Every person, 7 billion people should have this vaccine. These are interesting phenomena that are emerging now, which require interrogation. Then the other idea that data is the new oil or the new gold. What does that mean? And if you just go back, I mean, these are interesting exercises to do even for our minds. If you go back and look at what oil did, say, to the last century, the question is, do we want data to be that kind of new oil in this century, where virtually every war in the second half of the last century was fought, and the whole power structures were being determined on the basis of oil? Do we really want that kind of... The next is that this is a new form of globalization, because we're finding these are all companies that are global. They have global reach, they have global ambitions, and they want to be controlling all of this. So the kind of battles that we have is Indian companies saying, no, let's have data localization. The Indian government is happy because then it has control over the people. And the companies are happy because, like Mr. Mukesh Ambani said, please bring Indian data back to Indians, or at least to Indian corporates. It's a different matter that because it's global, you'll find Facebook becoming a part of Reliance. So it's a complex scenario, which if we just look if we look too close and we've got our faces one against the other, we may miss what we are supposed to see. And the last thing for this point is that since early this century, we got into this thing of e-governance. E-governance was not something people asked. It is something that from Heather Brooks's work, you find that after Y2K, when there wasn't very much to make their money on, technology companies spoke to governments. And it's like a relationship that's established with governments. And here I'm deriving from what Heather Brooks said, that so it's a relationship that gets established where the companies will be useful to the government and government will be useful to companies. And suddenly you find, like it happens with many World Bank and all these policies, you find that all around the world, developing world especially, e-governance becomes the big thing. So these are just things that I think we need to keep in our minds when we are looking at anything. And just one last thing, that going back to the first, that very often we find technologies that are provided to us now are problems masquerading as solutions of a problem that they have not identified correctly.
Shana, could you elaborate a little bit on that idea of privacy and power? What is that relationship of privacy and power?
Sure. See, this actually, Mr. Nilekani will also tell you that it is the UID project that really raised this question of privacy. Of course, he'll say that they are the ones who said that there should be a law on it, which may not even be untrue, because that's the first project that really threatened our privacy the way it did. And it's actually also fascinating because over the years he's been telling us that privacy is, why are you focusing on the UID project? Actually, it is smartphones that are a problem, because smartphones invade our privacy in ways, in fact, it tells people about what is happening in our minds. We keep things in it which can reveal our innermost workings. You know, many things that we talk, we say, we think, we keep notes, what we watch, all of this details us in various kinds of ways. Now, when the importance of many of these basic rights, like there is another right that will soon have to emerge, which is the right against suspicion. Most of the technologies today are being imposed on us, saying that you have to clear yourself of suspicion all the time. So the right to privacy was one such, where they were saying that we can collect all your information, we can use it in various kinds of ways, because this will result in efficiency, and it will, over a period, initially they said it will give an ID, then that it will, curb leakage and the rest of it. Now, in this process, the first thing that was going to get destroyed was this idea that I have right to certain information that no one else need know about me. And that there are phenomena like tracking, tracing, surveillance. These are things that should not be done, except where there is a reason for suspecting that there is something the matter, in which case you put it within the framework of investigation. And you have laws in India and laws in most countries on how you conduct that investigation, and which are the other agencies you bring in to make sure that the kind of investigation that you do is kept within parameters where that power doesn't allow you to overreach. So the main argument in the court, in fact, and the main argument on which many of us learned how to think about it, was that the Constitution, in the Indian context, for instance, is not about the power of the state over a people, but about the limits of the power of the state over a people. And privacy, in that sense, becomes the way by which we say, you don't own us or our information, or you don't have a right to know everything that you want about us. We live our lives. It is the right of people to have freedom and liberty, and it is the responsibility of a state to preserve and protect and further my freedom and liberty. So privacy comes well within that understanding of how far the power of the state can go, and what is that freedom and liberty of the individual. So it's much more complex than saying, it's not personal privacy. It's much more complex than that.
So, Usha, again, a question to you. This Puttuswamy understanding of necessity and proportionality and all of that, does it really capture the dynamic of such a complex equation?
Actually, I think the fact is that, all of us would accept that there is no right that is so absolute that there can be no kind of, there can be a certain whittling down of right that may happen either because of a circumstance or because you want everybody to have rights. So to that extent, but there is a problem in some of the ways in which these have been addressed. Now, the idea of proportionality is an unformed, undeveloped idea in our context. And the way it's being said is that it should be proportional to the object that you want to achieve. The legitimate state aim, it should be proportional to that. Actually, that needn't be right at all. In fact, if it has to be a rights-preserving interpretation of what proportionality is, it should be proportional in a way where you do not dilute the right more than is absolutely necessary for you to do. Which is why some of them use the language of compelling necessity. If there isn't a compelling necessity, don't do it. And the other huge, it's not just proportionality. The thing that really, that shouldn't be there at all is this idea of balancing of rights. There is no question of balancing that all rights exist, and you have to learn to respect all of them. If you start whittling down rights, then all of them vanish. We have a very strong understanding that there can be no waiver of fundamental rights. Why do we say there should be no waiver? Because we say that I may say, I don't want this right. You may not exercise it, but it is yours. Because no one is entitled, even you are not entitled to say, this is not my right. It is your right. That's the only way you can preserve it, where power, where authority, where control will not take rights away. So it's in this context.
So, Prerna, as we see, there is such a huge potential for this transforming into a surveillance state, and I'm sure even the private sector has its share of concerns around these things. So how exactly, forget corporates, even an NGO like yours or a for-profit database enterprise yours, as you were saying, you do have a lot of sensitive data that you have to deal with. And what are your views on this, and how do you really cope with it? Is the PDDP bill, is that the kind of solution that you would actually look at?
Right. No, I think a couple of very interesting things that Usha ma'am raised. So I think what I want to talk about now, Mahesh, is privacy and organizations such as ours that are deemed as data fiduciaries or custodians of data, and what is the extent of our rights over that data? Are these intermediary rights? Is it even fair for us to deem ourselves as interim owners of these data sets? Right. So I want to take a step back maybe and just talk about the larger context under which we decided to go in for a PDP, but more from the point of view of how that translates into real life every day. What does that mean for a survey firm? What does that mean for research? The pitfalls of it, but from a very practical standpoint, right? So I think I think a lot of this debate was also started a couple of years ago when some of us started thinking that we're making use of the Googles and Facebooks of the world, and they have their own heavy duty data laws. We don't have anything, but look at our numbers, we're so many. So some of this was actually maybe propagated by our aversion of their ownership of our data, but maybe and how these multinational companies could leverage some of this perhaps against us. And at some point we started thinking that given our sheer market size, can we sort of step in and affect the way some of these global policies are framed? And so I think in a lot of ways around the time that PDP, we started thinking about PDP sometime in 2017, and the version that was actually submitted in 2019, there's been a big departure in terms of what we initially thought would come through, and then what really happened. Now we're obviously drawing in a big way from GDPR, but again, there's a difference in how maybe the United States approaches it, which is more of a laissez-faire, that let the tech companies kind of jump in, work closely with policymakers to figure out how the larger ecosystem will look like, vis-a-vis in Europe, wherein maybe they'd like to hold data and governance slightly closer to themselves. So in a lot of these countries, they have these supervisory committees at the national level, which then report to a more centralized European data protection board. But I think in the case of India, the personal data protection bill is, of course, they are members of judiciary, but then the union government can, of course, interfere, and we see that happening in a big way over what the final draft of the PDP will look like. And there's a bunch of very disturbing things that have shown up. And I want to just quickly touch upon some definitions and talk about what that means. So of course, the basics of it is that we now split data into personal and non-personal data, and personal data is, of course, anything that can identify you as that individual. And then when we talk about sensitive personal data, we're talking about data points that fall under the ambit of maybe financial, sexual orientation, your religious preferences, your political affiliations, so on and so forth. And simply by means of the fact that the union government can perhaps interfere in how a lot of these laws are framed and formed, a coordination with a lot of international committees and authorities right here in India stands compromised. So we're already on the back foot, in some sense, when it comes to that. Now, when we talk about so if the PDP was, the larger thinking there was data encryption and can be sort of prevent misuse, have a system for grievance redressal, all of that. But then the larger goal was, of course, was to protect the rights of the individual. Now, one of the things that it suggests is that maybe you as the respondent, maybe you as the data principal can withdraw consent at a later date or restrict your disclosure. Now, what does that mean for a data collection organization such as mine? I go into a lot of rural neighborhoods, I collect data online, but most of my work is offline. So let's say I come back with a data spend, I spend 6 months collecting. I run my models on it and I suggest a way forward. Maybe it's a predictive model, and I use that to suggest a way forward to certain body, private body, government body, all of that. Now, let's say 6 months hence, a certain set of stakeholders withdraw their consent. Number one, how are they withdrawing their consent? What is the procedure for it? Some of that can be very tricky, but what does that mean for the suggestions I made to these bodies? What does that mean? And we work on a lot of panel data sets, Mahesh. What that really means is that we are going back to the same respondent every 2 years, every year, every 6 months. Now, if in this larger engine of a data set, a couple of individuals or a couple of organizations decide to withdraw or pull support, does that put the entire exercise at risk, right? So what does that mean for me? I'm not in the clear. The next thing, and this is, I think, one of the more disturbing problems that I'm guessing Usha ma'am will have a ton to say about, is what we call, grounds for processing personal data, and how under special circumstances, personal data, you need not draw consent from personal data, and how the state is allowed to do all of that if it's for a legal purpose, for a medical purpose, or perhaps even to provide benefits to the individual. Now, what does that mean for me? So a lot of interventions that we run, or some of the policies that we are actually evaluating, we're an auditor. Some of those policies don't come out right on top, right? So in certain cases, maybe the consequence of certain policies was that maybe a lot of stakeholders are being left out. And I won't get into specifics because I'm not authorized to, but or certain stakeholders felt disadvantaged. What we also call random control trials, that you give the medicine to a certain subset, but you don't give it to another subset, and then you evaluate, right? So the ethics of it all, why aren't you giving the medicine to both sides? But that's a different conversation, right? So my point is that if I am then required to give out my data sets to the state under the guise of what they're calling evidence-based policy making of a better targeting of services, what does that mean for me as an organization, when I'm kind of guaranteeing to everybody I'm talking to that, listen, your privacy stands protected? And in fact, any survey we do, Mahesh, there is this giant form, which is a note right on top that, listen, I'm from Outline India, and then I'm explaining to you what survey I'm doing, what are the details of it, how am I going to use your data, and you can choose to say no. Mind you, since this law has not been passed just yet, in our consent forms, we don't just yet ask the respondent or give them recourse to pulling out their consent at a later date. So we don't do that just yet, but of course, that's something that might change at a later date. And I find that to be, I don't know honestly how to deal with something like that. Again, something that's come in is, like I said, the right to be forgotten as has to be guaranteed to the data principal. But how do I, as a research partner, as a data partner that's working very closely with policymakers, with research institutions, many of whom are also sitting abroad. So if I'm running a lot of research here in India, some of which might be funded by the Gates Foundation or by the World Bank, what does it mean for me as I process that data here, analyze that data here, but maybe the findings are sent to a principal investigator who's sitting across the ocean? Am I now saying that in a certain way, because I'm also sharing a lot of sensitive data points, and the government also says that no critical data set can be processed or stored outside. So are you now implying that I cannot hire a principal investigator who's non-Indian, or do I need to fly them in here? What are the rules? What if they fly back? I mean, there's a lot of confusion around some of these variables. Of course, localization has been a heavily debated subject, and for instance, RBI has had it for the longest time, right? So in India, it is mandated that all our payment data be stored here. But as a research institution that plays with so much data at a granular level and large data sets that deal with vulnerable populations, how do I deal with a law that A, at one level doesn't give me clarity, and B, at another level implies things that are not executable? So the PDP kind of does not lay that out for me in a big way. What's also kicked in this version of the PDP is a fine. So if I don't adhere to these processing and storage laws, I'm liable either 15 crores or 4% of my annual revenue, whichever is higher. And what does that mean for innovation, for data firms, for startups, for younger organizations? That's a very, very tricky thing. And I'd love to hear from Usha ma'am on that. My next comment is on a new category that's been introduced this time, which is called social media intermediaries. And this is really funny because it excludes search engines, it excludes providers who give you access to data, but it defines social media intermediaries as those organizations that allow interaction of people and have users beyond point, like a certain number. So in essence, we're talking about the Facebooks, the TikToks, the Twitters of the world. And the government kind of adds a caveat here that we want all those organizations who can affect electoral democracy or affect public opinion in a big way to allow for providing voluntary user verification mechanism for everybody in India. Now, the problem here is I don't know what kind of proof is needed for this voluntary user verification. And it's extremely hazy. So there's a lot of confusion around why there are these exceptions made for social media intermediaries when organizations such as ours, who are actually working at the grassroots or in the interest of data, don't have a way forward. Again, it has another caveat which says that processing of personal data for other reasonable purposes, and it includes operation of search engines. So now, are search engines allowed to play with data endlessly? What does that mean? Very tricky. What I've also been asked to do now as a result of some of this is that since retrogressively I might have to go back and fix data sets. So if you, Mahesh, once this law is passed, tell me that Prerna, in the month of June, 2021, if you tell me, Prerna, I don't like the idea of the data I submitted to you 2 years ago, I am legally required to purge that data. How do I do that? How is that executable? Papers would have been published, those data sets would be out there, a lot of research would have been done on top of those data sets. So how executable is some of this? I mean, I understand that I need to protect the individual's privacy, but how do I execute it? Last but not the least, there's another caveat which says I am now required to have something called a consent manager on board my team. And so every data fiduciary, which means data organization such as mine, should have a consent manager whose responsibility is to, and I read this from the directive, give, withdraw, review, manage consent through an accessible platform. What do you mean by this? Do you mean that there has to be a tech platform wherein the user can go withdraw permission? Am I supposed to have a call center? Am I supposed to have a point of contact? And again, Mahesh, I mean, my point is that we're dealing with a lot of rural populations. Most people don't even have phone numbers that they continue to use beyond a couple of months. You get a some cheap talk time, you flip numbers, switch numbers. They will never even be able to reach me, in all honesty, right? So, I mean, is this supposed to be very namesake? You know, that's a different debate altogether. But I think what's really required is, I'm really hoping that this law in its current shape and form is not passed, because that's doomsday for a lot of innovation. But it's just not executable is my problem. My last comment on the private sector piece that you said, I think I find that to be very, very interesting. Now, and I won't touch upon Arogya Setu just yet, because that's a Pandora's box. But but I think if the state is now allowed to ask a tech company, whether it's my tech platform or an Amazon or a Swiggy or a health-based app, if the state so deems that it can help with providing social benefits or for better policy making, what does that mean? Now, a lot of these tech companies have invested so much money in developing these algorithms, and I'm not getting into whether and how they're collecting these, but an Amazon recommending products to you, or an Uber better knowing what route to take to get from A to B. Now, if the government wants to figure how to best deliver medicines from A to B using Uber's data set, who is to decide whether the government is right in wanting this information? If it's to deliver medicines, then is it okay for the government having access to it? But is it for something completely frivolous? Who decides what's frivolous and what's not frivolous? And is it okay for us to make a blanket allowance for the government to do something like that? I want to say no, but I want to add a couple of caveats. I just don't know how far those caveats can go. And what is the kind of message you are then sending out to a lot of young companies, startups, innovators, by saying that, listen, you may have developed algorithm X, or you might have these piles and piles of data, but some government body might wake up one fine day and decide, you owe them that data set. So what happens, right? Over to you, Mahesh.
Yeah. Thank you, Prerna. Those are very interesting points. Now, at the risk of being that moderator who ends up talking more than the panelists, let me try and actually capture some of the interesting themes that emerged from her discussion. One is, for me, is this private sector talking that all these regulations and these micromanagement, it's actually stifling our innovation. We are actually coming out with great products that has the potential for revolutionizing the world. In many ways, some of the examples that she gave, just dealing with bad traffic or all of that, probably relying on big data and using the existing data sets that these people have developed, it can be put to a lot of good use. And probably there is much more that we can come out with that you and I can't imagine at this rate. So please don't try and come in and regulate us so much at this juncture, because it's really stifling innovation and probably it's stifling human progress. That's one argument that we see. Secondly is also, picking up on some of the questions that I see. Kev has asked this question about what does this mean for surveillance capitalism? What are your thoughts about that? Aditya Saxena has posed this interesting question. I mean, at the end of the day, there is so much of data that's coming out. Netflix is collecting a lot of data to deliver what are the shows that we like. Google is picking up a lot of it to just give us what are the products that we might end up liking. So in any case, this is being used. And he's citing a study. There was a survey by TPI, and the results of the survey says that people are actually willing to pay a certain price if willing to actually share their data if they're actually being paid a certain price for it. Price might be money, price might be some other services that we need. So do we actually have to get so worried about these things? I mean, after all, yes, there is the potential for big surveillance capitalism to come into existence. But at the end of the day, how bad can it get? After all, what are we getting? A few advertisements and maybe a little bit of knowledge about what time we are, what is the best price at which we are willing to pay for taking an Uber ride. Usha, what are your thoughts on that?
So just a few things. First thing is that because it's not going to be too long a discussion, I'll do it in the context of principles that I'm seeing emerging from this. Yeah. So the one way of looking at data today, one thing to remember is that data today is not the kind of data that we were talking about when we were looking at it 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 30 years ago, or even 25 years ago, or 20 years ago. Because at that time we were talking about data, meaning information about various kinds of things, like how many people are there, what is our workforce, how much work is there, what is our mineral resources, how many, what are the trees in the forest, how much biodiversity do we have. That changed with, and there's a Rangarajan Committee report which dealt with the earlier Collection of Statistics Act, which basically says that with liberalization, all that data becomes irrelevant, because anyway, it's like a kind of laissez-faire kind of thing. So what we will do now is collect information about people. And so the new Collection of Statistics Act actually allows the government to ask anybody to come and ask us any questions that they want to ask. And if we refuse to give that information, we can be punished with either fine or imprisonment. Or if we give information, not just refuse, if we give information that they find is misleading or wrong. So this idea of the reporting and documented citizen is a new idea that has come with these technologies. See, each age produces its own villains. The Industrial Revolution produced its own villainy in terms of the way the working classes got treated, the way the environment got devastated, oil came in and added to it. So with the kind of good that went with it, there came a whole host of harm. And today we find we are stuck with climate change. We have to figure out whether, where this is headed. If it's not going there, then, but we have to, my constant thing is interrogate, because we don't know enough and it's just being rolled out. So the idea of data as property is a highly questionable way of looking at data, because today data is not about all of this. Data is personal information, and personal information being used, and as we have seen in our context, it is quickly becoming personal information as a public good to which the state has a right, which it can then apportion to whoever it wants to apportion, not only the data itself, but because they may also collect data from those who are collecting it. But like with guns, they can license who is allowed to collect it and who is not. Yeah, so it's a potent weapon that's been created. This falls within the idea of eminent domain. When we studied other, these are all ideas have a continuum in a lot of ways. So if you understand it in the context of eminent domain in the beginning was, private company, the government, state can acquire private land for a public purpose on payment of compensation. So all of these had to be there. It had to be private land for a public purpose on payment of compensation. Over a period of time, you find that both the colonial state and the post-colonial, the independent state, start expanding this idea to say all land in the territory of the state actually belongs with the state, which people can keep till the state wants it back. And then it may use it for development or for whatever other purposes it may want. And it may take it saying that is for that, but it may not actually be able to use it, say, for a tuberculosis hospital or whatever. But it can nevertheless retain it and decide what to do with it. So first it was land, water, mineral resources, forests. Now it is personal information. So we really need to understand what it means when eminent domain powers are being exercised over our data and what our personal information. Data makes it sound impersonal. This is about personal information. So what does that mean? That's just one way of looking at it. The second thing is that there were a series of questions. So that, and in no particular order, I think it's also interesting that, when Redna was talking about the state saying that you're going to, that they want to take all this information so that they can deliver services better. The idea that you can't deliver services without breaching people's rights, that is, I have to stamp on some rights to be able to deliver other rights, is a very weird phenomenon. So I think, fundamentally it is unacceptable. But if we want to say that we want to accept it to a certain extent, we have to see what. And, whether they are that is people's choices that get made and people are going along with it. Demonetization was a classic case where they said, everyone now go on to, digital currency. And when people had no choice and were pushed to it, they used it to a certain extent. But after that, most cash has come back. Currency has come back. So the choices people are making is very different from what the state is trying to get people to do. And they are not getting to do it only because the state wants us to do it, but because that is the next big place where digital footprints can be left, where money moving from place to place can be seen. Fintech companies can find themselves dislodging banks and being able to be mobile and flexible and agile in the way in which they conduct their businesses. So it's not done to enhance the rights of people. It is done to enhance the business interests of various people. So this idea that economy comes before rights is something that I think we really need to closely interrogate. The third thing is, which takes us on to innovation, which you were talking about. This idea that innovation is stifled by law, stifled by rights. And look at America, how many things they've been able to get, their Googles and their Amazons. And I'm like, yeah, they created that and they've created a problem for the whole world. Because it's, the kind of appropriation of data. We've seen, initially it seemed innocent. Initially we didn't notice it, then it seemed innocent. And then you have Cambridge Analytica. So, and it's Cambridge Analytica has just become a metaphor for the number of things that are happening in the world around us. So so first of all, this idea that innovation can't be bound by rules, it can't be bound by the constitution, it can't be bound by rights, these are all stifling, is a fascinating concept. But we must also remember that what this is saying is that innovation has to happen with being able to experiment, which means they should be able to do it without liability. And when you look at what, in a classic case, and I'll just in brief tell you the story of biometrics, I'm writing the whole thing out, but in the meantime, really, I'll try to make it brief. In 2009, when they decided to adopt biometrics in the UID project, they did not know anything about biometrics. And I'm not saying this, all that I'm saying comes from documents that have come from within the UIDAI. So there is a document in 2009 December, there was a letter in 2009 September which said, we actually don't know, but we've decided we're going to adopt this as the unique identifier, the way to produce the unique number. So let's do it. Then in 2010, you have them saying to a biometric consultant who they are inviting that actually we know nothing, not just us, but nowhere in the developing world do we know whether biometrics can work. And the only people who studied this in any depth are in the US, which is the NIST. And they've told us that demographic and environmental conditions make a difference. So now that we told you this, find us a protocol that will make it work. It's a very weird thing to ask. I mean, if it doesn't work, how do you make it work? So shouldn't you first find out whether it will work or not? Then the story goes through a range of things, which I'll put out in a much larger document some other time. But we find exclusions starting to happen. And people tell you all the time that it is happening. And then you come to now, where, and I'm not telling you all the exclusions that have happened, you can go back and look, but this is one document that many people have not seen, so I should talk about this, where they say that for a certain classes of people, fingerprint may not work. But fingerprint is what has been decided to be used for one nation, one ration. UID with fingerprint. So what do you do if a migrant worker, his fingerprint does not work? So they say you can nominate somebody else who will lend you their fingerprint. And they will be, their fingerprint will identify you. What happens to that whole idea of identity and of me? So they have, people above 60, people below 15, people who are visually handicapped, people who can't move, people who can't travel, a family of 4 where nobody's biometrics work. For all these people, you can have somebody nominated. So my identity gets nominated. And this is the ridiculous level that we have today reached. And we have the chief economic advisor saying, we have sent the business correspondent everywhere and people did not take money out of the Jan Dhan accounts. The amount of money in the different Jan Dhan accounts kept growing through this period of the COVID, which is indication that there was no distress. So I'll just tell you one brief story and then I'll move to the next thing, which is, there's a cruel story of a scientist and a frog. And the scientist, he was experimenting with the frog, and so he took away one leg of the frog. The frog was there, he said, jump. The frog jumped. Then he took away one leg. It was hurtful, but it somehow managed to jump. Then he took away the second leg, and it struggled even more and it jumped. The third leg really struggled, but it managed to lift itself up. The fourth leg, when he took off, and he kept shouting at it, jump, 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 it didn't move. So he wrote as his conclusion, when you take all the 4 legs off a frog, it goes deaf. Our biometric experiment is something like this today. So this is one whole area. I think we should talk about Arogya Setu. It doesn't make sense not to do it. First of all, this is a country where in 2018 study, so there might have been some more, some additions, some deletions, whatever in this time. 2018 study says that 17% of the people in this country have smartphones. This app works only on smartphones. Now, already we've talked 100 times about digital divide, and I think Prerna was really fair in it, saying so many of these are people that you work with who don't understand what this technology does to them. So what is the kind of responsibility we need to take? And you have now people being told that you can't get onto a train, you can't go into work, you can't have any of your basic civil rights if you haven't downloaded this app, even though this app has not been proved to help you in figuring out what is happening around. So if I have the app, if I have the phone and then I have an app on it, and then I keep uploading saying that, I did a test and this is what the test showed, and there is another person who's a whole set of imponderables. My worry is not only about what will happen with the data and all of that, but it's also how much exclusion this is going to bring. And it is also this, that it gives a false sense of security. You think you have the app and therefore you're protected. What does the app do? So fear, ignorance are being worked on to impose all of this. Now, the most important thing in this is that the state is using power that is way beyond the law. There is a difference, that's why, at least in my head, between administering in a state and governing a state. When the World Bank brought back the idea of governance, their idea was, if we say a project has to happen, then you make the project happen, it is good governance. Which is why today they'll say, oh, land, it's a problem, labor is a problem, let's change all those rules, because people don't want to give up their land. Of course they don't want to give up their land. And labor law is a big problem, so they should work for 12 hours and 15 hours and 72 hours a week and what have you. And no, there should be hire and fire for the employer. So this lopsidedness, when you bring that in, you see what is happening with who controls what, and the powerless becoming even more powerless because of this digital divide.
Prerna, I'd like to hear your thoughts, especially on this idea that do we really need innovation that cannot stand with or that is at odds with our concepts of rights and core constitutional values? I mean, is it actually innovation that is worth pursuing?
So first of all, I mean, I think it's unfair to say that all innovations exploit upon our fundamental rights. I think it might be better to state that by its very nature, innovation is something new, right? It could be a new product or service, and hence the legality around it will be fuzzy because that product or service perhaps did not exist earlier. So it's not as if the innovator himself or herself set out to flout the laws or set out with a certain mindset that, listen, maybe this is a loophole I found, so let's jump at it. So I think I have a problem with that line of thinking that innovators by nature are making.
I think just to clarify, I don't think there was an argument that all innovators are flouting the law. The more basic question to ask is, do we need to permit parties to undertake innovation which is at odds with our concept of rights? Even there might be some projected great use coming out of that, or let me use the word, there might be utility in that innovation. But if it doesn't sit well with rights, is it something that we should permit at all?
I mean, there could be two responses to that, right, Mahesh? One is that no, if it doesn't sit well with your rights, what do you do with it? You do away with the innovation. What about those who are okay giving up on those rights? Right? So my point always is that there can be no one right answer. But I have one statistic that actually has been bothering me quite a bit. With respect to Arogya Setu itself, the government made it mandatory some time back, but before it became mandatory, in the first 13 days, there were 50 million downloads. It was not mandatory then, Mahesh. right?
Hmm.
Now I understand, and there was this other study out by MIT and everything, wherein there were certain goods stated about Arogya Setu, there were certain bads about it. So I just want to quickly lay out what I thought was good, what I thought was bad. Because I had some friends, acquaintances, and some founders who I know who personally worked on the app. I think they launched the app in a 10-day time period, working through the night. I think so. It's innovation at scale, at pace, and for that reason, I think them coming together with a lot of government bodies to put something out is brilliant. Now, if I was to answer, do I think it serves the very purpose it set out to achieve? I'm not so sure, and I'll try and tell you why. Right? I mean, how is it really solving the problem of contract tracing, right? You are risk stratifying people on the basis of my response. So my 70-year-old father downloaded the app and he's reading out questions like, oh, did I go out? He's like, let's answer no. Did I meet anyone? No. So, are you, the kind of data sets that you're putting out, what is the kind of message that you're sending out? And if, for instance, when you are risk stratifying, you are kind of saying, okay, this entire sample of people classify as a problem zone, and this entire sample of people classify as, they're good to go green zone, when that's really not necessarily the case. So in a crisis such as this, I think one really has to get into the scientificity of it, right? I mean, if we ourselves don't know too much about COVID-19, we don't know if the infection can come back. They're now saying that there can be neurological issues to it. So if epidemiologists themselves are not very clear on the issues with COVID-19, how are we sort of going about picking up chunks of data, pulling that Excel sheet and coming out with these models? So, this is a classic case of using data to its own detriment, wherein you are assuming that if it grew at this pace here, it will grow at this pace here, or if it came down here at this pace. There's no one right fit right now. No epidemiologist will put their name behind any such model. So I think one has to be very clear in terms of the usability of that app. I think one count that perhaps, so there's this new directive that came out on 11th May, wherein the government put out this 7-pager on, they tried to define what they mean by an individual. They tried to define what they mean by location data. And so I think they took in the opinion of a lot of stakeholders and organizations, and I do appreciate that. But then again, the moment you declare something like this mandatory, you're kind of encroaching on my civil liberties, and I, even as a data person, I have a problem with that. But then that directive also stated that within 180 days, that data will be purged. I thought, that's a good thing. By the way, India is the only country that's made the contract tracing app mandatory. So, everybody was like, okay, what's happening? My other problem is then with the sharing of these data. So a lot of centralized agencies can pass it along to other bodies and other state governments, and then they are required to follow this protocol. But the caveat comes in when you bring in third parties. So the government is technically saying, and does not define what all we mean by this third party, but technically the data set can be shared with a third party as long as those third parties are following these protocols also. Who's going to go check who's following what, and what does this really mean for my privacy? Circumspect. And also, I think, Mahesh, in the day and age that we live in, you might pass along like an anonymized data set to me, but using cryptography and a lot of tools at hand, I think de-anonymization is not the trickiest thing.
Yeah.
So, what does it mean? So no, I do not have an answer. I think it's great that like I said, a lot of startups came together to put together something that they deemed useful. And I think I want to ask Usha ma'am a question, right? I understand the goods and the bads of Arogya Setu, but give me a solution. Arogya Setu is bad, maan liya. Why don't, if we are willing to go out and put our names behind and say, this is bad, this is encroaching on my privacy, agreed. Give me a solution at pace, at scale, that does not include technology that's so damn cheap. Over to you, Mahesh.
I think, Usha, you heard the question.
Yeah. Actually, I find that an interesting question because it doesn't even deal with the problem. See, the problem that we've had now is of large 60% of the population, you know, like in Bombay, for instance, over 40% of the people live in slum areas. You've had migrants not being allowed to leave cities and being forced to stay in extremely, you know, precarious circumstances. So what is it that what are you seeking a solution? This will help in the state figuring out when they want to figure out who can be traced as having been in contact or been in the proximity of who. That's it. It's not going to help masses of the people in this country. And it's not going to help even those few who download it when those masses, when they come in contact with those masses. So, you know, this idea that when something has been offered as a solution, we don't question it and we don't put it aside till we find a solution to what it has defined as the problem. That's been a problem for a very long time now. In the UID, they did the same thing. They said, okay, so you don't want UID. What do you want then? And I said, yeah, decentralization, autonomy, people being able to exercise control over various and diverse solutions depending upon the state, the kind of, the kind of political or social power that people have, the idea of caste in various kinds of places like this. Without accounting for all that, you can't seek a solution. So I really don't think, I'm not able to receive the question like that. But there are a couple of things that, a couple of other things that you said. One of the most interesting things that you said, which I think as a people we need to address, is that even without the mandatoriness, people downloaded that app. So when the UID enrollment started, I had friends of mine who got their appointment at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know, the early days, people had to get appointment and then fix up appointment and go. And he's a guy who sleeps at 9 o'clock and wakes up at 5. And he went at 2 o'clock in the morning to stand in that queue and get himself the UID right in the beginning. Because in this country, which is why I keep saying, this is a country where you do not see anarchy. This is a country where people largely follow what is required of them. You may break a traffic signal here and a traffic signal there. But if we were actually to be the kind of, wild country which requires to be controlled and managed, we wouldn't be the way we are. So I think this, we are being recast in a certain kind of mold, which is why I say the freedom from suspicion, that people steal, people are corrupt, people are this, that, and the other. One of the most fascinating things that happened in this period was in the first 10 years of this century, if you go back and look at who were the, what were the great cases of corruption, you'll find that each of them had political people, bureaucrats, and corporates. And after the 9th and 10th year, you said that these three people will monitor the rest of the people to see that they are not corrupt, that they are not, taking away things. So it's a question of how we imagine the system and what we know about the system. When we are talking about evidence-based, I don't want to make a point of this, but the idea of evidence is for what? We don't need any evidence to say that it's a good idea to have universalization of PDS or universalization of being able to give grain to everyone, because the extent of poverty is so huge that, even a high court like Karnataka High Court, where they've actually given some extraordinarily good orders during this lockdown, even there is this thing that gets slipped in saying, yeah, check their ID and then give it to them. No, check if they are hungry and give them food. You don't have to check their ID to do this. There is a way in which, so I just want to go back to the beginning for a bit to say that, there are two phenomena that we noticed. There is a process by which some of these things are happening. And we are at even Arogya Setu. It's not just Arogya Setu. In Ahmedabad, Gujarat government has put out a thing saying that you can only buy provisions, because now it's complete lockdown and you can have things delivered to you. You can only pay through digital forms, because currency transfer, what's the word?
Surface transfer.
Yeah, so it transfers this virus from one person to another, and therefore currency is a bad idea. But I heard Dr. Guleria, who's really the expert, telling us that don't worry about reading the newspaper. It's not a problem. It doesn't get transferred, transmitted like that. Now, why do you find everywhere? See, there is a difference between opportunity and opportunism. I see Arogya Setu and this kind of a thing that's coming in as opportunism. And no state should be opportunistic with its own people. It should be respecting of the rights of the people. The second thing is that this is a period, and especially in the context of technology, but also in many other contexts. Actually, with the state, I shouldn't say it's just technology. There is a way in which the state has been constantly placing itself in a state of exception, where it says, I will instruct and you obey, but nothing binds me as the state. You were talking about the data protection law, Prerna. You notice that the state says it is for everybody else, but I don't have any rules that bind me. I can do what I want. I can take data from anyone. I can give data to anyone. I can collect it through coercion, consent. The Contract Act, which applies to everybody else, doesn't apply to me. This idea that the state has been allowed, and this is not being done by the state on its own. There is a collaboration that is happening between technology controllers and the state, which is resulting in this. India's stack is a classic example of evangelizing the state and getting what private industry wants, while by telling the state that it can get what it wants. So it is selling surveillance and tracking to the state so that it can make its own money and its own businesses on this. These are things that, somebody like you, in your business sounds interesting to me. It doesn't sound threatening at all. But that's because you have an object, a purpose for which you're collecting this, and you're thinking about it responsibly. You're not thinking about it as, I've got this information, let me see what I can do with this. There's a huge difference. If you wouldn't mind, the way I heard you wouldn't mind if there were rules and you knew what to follow. But when today, the way because you're saying, it's really, we are at a time where they started with digitization, they went on to ID, and then it moved to ubiquity, where they said everywhere you have to put your, you have to put your number, or put this number so that you can be seen everywhere. And then they moved on to making this data into part of the economy and collecting data wherever they can. And then AI. Where has AI resurfaced from? I was born at a time and I grew up in years when AI was a very exciting thing, because as Isaac Asimov wrote about it, and that's what we knew about it. So AI is not new. What is new is that the idea of data has shifted from various other places to the person. And the person is now becoming not just, we are not a customer anymore. The state is the customer. There are no custodians anymore. Somebody like you may treat yourself responsibility as a custodian. But the idea has changed because anyone can see the collection principle to say that you can collect whatever, but be careful with it once you've collected it, and making us hand over that information or else we don't get that service. These are extraordinary moments that we are having desperately in a hurry to interrogate. Arogya Setu is part of that. It is the state telling us, when I tell you, you should do it, you should do it. And for those for whom the system works, they may not think about what it means. For those for whom the system does not work, very often have no choice. In Arogya Setu, it is meaningless because most of the people actually don't have what it takes to even get onto it, even if they're desperate, even if they're willing to do it, or even if they say, okay, the state is asking, let me do it. That's what makes it so plain. And I like the fact that it is plain because it makes the discussion and understanding of this so much easier. I just switch on the lighting.
We've actually overshot our time quite a lot, but the engaging discussion that it was, we were quite too involved, and I actually forgot that we overshot our time. That's my bad. But then I actually see a lot of questions here, and many of them are questions that specifically relate to provisions of the Data Protection Act or something very specific about the data protection law. For these people, I would actually say that tomorrow we are having a dedicated masterclass on data protection. And probably that's the right place for you to shoot these questions. I welcome you all to participate in that. And probably we'll find more time over there in that session to take up all these granular questions on principles of data protection. But then I think, please.
Just one broad statement on this.
Yeah.
That when we are thinking data protection, I think it will be useful if we think of data protection is not about protecting data. Data protection is about protecting people. And therefore, protecting data becomes important. So never to lose sight of this, that it's not about having data and then protecting that data, but it is about any law of this kind is so that people and their rights are protected.
Thank you. I think, for all of these little things that we attempted to debate in 1 hour, I think we were being overconfident and too ambitious in trying to really unpack a large number of complex things in 1 hour. But let's hope that we've actually set the ball rolling in the minds of the people to this big question in our enthusiasm to embrace the brave new world. Are we going back to 1984? That's something that we'll have to keep discussing and debating further. And for those of you who are interested in these themes, who want to further engage with these questions, we welcome you to please enroll yourself in the Daksha Fellowship. We are taking up the second round of applications and we are closing on the 25th. So please apply soon. Those of you who are still in the process of completing your applications, we encourage you to finish it as soon as possible. And remember that we are offering a full tuition fee waiver to all participants this year. So please, we welcome you to our fellowship, and probably we can have Usha and Prerna coming down here to Chennai, and we'll have more detailed discussion, maybe a whole one-day discussion around the things that we started talking about. I'll actually leave you all with one question to ponder about whether, are we testing the limits of law itself as an enterprise to deal with these questions? I go back to the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Most lawyers were focusing about how there was breach of personal information, how this was a matter that concerned individual privacy. But for me, the debate was, or the real scandal was how data or this private information was actually used for the purpose of targeted advertisement, for the purpose of creating a bubble around what we already have in social media. And that had a influence on politics. It probably amplifies, helps people to amplify the bubble that we've already set up around ourselves in social media. And the real impact of this is on how it is going to affect democracy, how it's going to affect the nature of our polity itself in the coming years. And it's a big question to ask whether privacy is the right frame within which we can answer these questions. It's a big question to ask whether law itself as an instrument will be the right platform, or to what extent can we really answer these questions using the frame of human rights law as we understand it today. But probably that's a bigger debate. Maybe that's a debate that we'll have to undertake on a different day. And I hope Usha ma'am will be there to engage on those questions at a later date. Probably we'll set up another round of conversations around this. So on behalf of Daksha, I really thank both of you for taking off time from this, what is a taxing schedule. I'm not saying that people are busy, but all of us are quite taxed mentally with the extended lockdown. So for taking out time from this taxing times and to engage with these questions. Thank you all who participated in this webinar. We hope we've been able to set the ball rolling and introduce some set of ideas into your brains. Probably we'll take it up for greater discussion in the coming days. Thank you. Thank you very much.